Marcus Holt shifted uneasily in his seat aboard the observation deck of the diplomatic vessel. The swirling gray and green planet below was unlike any he'd ever seen, its atmosphere a shimmering blend of gases alive with electrical storms that danced across its surface. As one of the United Earth Council's top linguists, he had visited many strange worlds, but the Xerians were a mystery. No human had set foot on their home world in over a century. Any updates from the envoy? Marcus asked, glancing toward the comms console. Beside him, Lieutenant Eric Voss leaned against the control panel, arms folded. Still waiting on their landing codes, Eric replied. They like to take their time. Marcus exhaled slowly, running a hand through his short, dark hair. The Xerians were a proud, insular people, famous for their isolation. The Council's attempt to open a dialogue was unprecedented. It would require patience and a level of tact that Marcus wasn't sure anyone had mastered yet. Relax, Eric said, sensing his friend's tension. You've been in tougher rooms than this. Remember those Morthuan pirates on Siller 6? Different situation, Marcus muttered. The Morthuan didn't care about protocol. They just wanted the ransom. The Xerians, they're complicated. Eric chuckled. Complicated is putting it mildly. But that's why you're here, right? Mr. Galactic Bridge Builder and all. Marcus shot him a look, but the teasing was a welcome distraction. Eric had been assigned as his security liaison, a seasoned officer with a knack for keeping things grounded. Though Eric had no formal diplomatic training, his no-nonsense attitude and quick wit made him the perfect counterbalance to Marcus's cautious, methodical approach. The comms console finally lit up, drawing their attention. A calm, measured voice filled the room. Terran vessel, this is Xerian Command. You are cleared to land at Diplomatic Port Theta. About time, Eric said under his breath, before adding, acknowledged Xerian Command. Beginning descent. The vessel's engines hummed as the descent protocol initiated. Marcus felt a slight pull of gravity as the ship dropped into the planet's atmosphere. Outside the viewport, the chaotic storms of the upper layers gave way to an awe-inspiring landscape, emerald plains dotted with crystalline structures that refracted the pale sunlight into vibrant patterns. When the ship touched down, Marcus and Eric stood at the airlock, both adjusting their uniforms. The Xerians had a reputation for formality, and Marcus had made sure to review every detail of their customs beforehand. They'll probably want to scan us before we even say hello, Marcus remarked. Just as long as they don't scan us twice, Eric quipped. The airlock hissed open and they stepped out onto a polished platform of translucent material. A delegation of Xerians waited at the base of the ramp, their shimmering white robes a stark contrast to the muted greens of the surrounding terrain. In the center stood a tall figure with silver hair and piercing violet eyes, Kalia, the Xerian prime delegate. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable. Welcome to Xeria, she said, her voice clear and steady. Marcus inclined his head respectfully. Thank you for having us, Prime Delegate. I'm Marcus Holt, Chief Envoy of the United Earth Council. This is Lieutenant Eric Voss, my security liaison. Eric nodded slightly. Ma'am. Kalia's gaze lingered on Eric for a moment before returning to Marcus. Your presence here is unusual. I hope you understand the gravity of this meeting. We do, Marcus assured her. Our goal is to understand, not impose. We believe mutual cooperation could benefit both our peoples. Kalia studied him in silence for a moment. Her piercing gaze made Marcus feel as if she were weighing his very essence. Then she turned and gestured for them to follow. Come. The council awaits. As they walked, Marcus tried to take in the environment around him without appearing too curious. The Xerian architecture was unlike anything he'd seen before, delicate spires that looked almost organic yet seemed as strong as steel. The air carried a faint metallic tang, and the light from above shifted in color as clouds passed over the crystalline structures. Quite a place, Eric murmured quietly. Kalia glanced back, her sharp hearing catching his remark. It is our home. We protect it with great care. I can see why, Marcus replied. It's stunning. She did not respond, but her pace slowed slightly, allowing them to draw level. As they approached the council chamber, Marcus felt a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. The Xerians were known for their cold, analytical approach to diplomacy. Even the smallest misstep could derail months of planning. Inside the chamber, the Xerian council members stood in a semicircle, their features as reserved as Kalia's. Introductions were brief and the discussion quickly turned to the purpose of their visit. Marcus presented the proposal for a trade and knowledge exchange, emphasizing the potential benefits for both sides. As he spoke, Eric kept a watchful eye on the room. He knew Marcus could handle himself, but it was clear that the Xerians were scrutinizing every word, every gesture. Despite their formal demeanor, there was an undercurrent of tension that Eric couldn't ignore. Kalia's voice cut through the room. And why exactly should we trust you? Humans have not always been considerate of other species. Marcus took a deep breath. You're right to be cautious. But times have changed. We've learned from our past mistakes. And we're not here to force anything. We want to understand your culture, your knowledge, and to share our own in return. The decision to collaborate is yours and yours alone. For a moment, Kalia said nothing. Then she nodded slightly. We will deliberate. Until then, you may remain as our guests. Marcus bowed his head in acknowledgement. Thank you, Prime Delegate. As the meeting concluded, Marcus and Eric were led to their quarters, Spartan but comfortable rooms within the crystalline complex. Once alone, Eric dropped into a chair and sighed. Was it just me, or did that feel more like an interrogation than a meeting? Marcus smiled faintly. They're not going to make this easy for us. But I think Kalia is at least willing to listen. Eric smirked. She didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. No, Marcus agreed. But she didn't close the door either. As the two men discussed the day's events, they began to strategize their next move. They knew winning over the Xerians would be a slow, careful process. For Marcus, this was the first step in what he hoped would be a journey of understanding and collaboration, one that would require more than just words. It would demand trust, respect, and perhaps something even deeper. Chapter 2, A Fragile Accord. Marcus, have you seen the datapad with the council notes? Eric called out from the next room. The quarters they'd been given were simple, functional, and completely devoid of personal touches, which made finding anything twice as hard. I left it on the table, Marcus replied, walking in and scanning the room. His sharp eyes immediately spotted the corner of the pad peeking out from under a neatly folded Xerian-style shawl. Eric shook his head. Why you thought putting it under that thing was a good idea? He cut himself off and tossed the pad to Marcus. Never mind. So what's the plan for today? Marcus powered up the pad, reviewing the notes they'd gathered from the previous day's meeting. The council's main concern seems to be trust. We need to convince them we're not here to exploit them, and that means showing we understand their priorities. Eric leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. And those priorities are cultural preservation, technological integrity, and maintaining their independence, Marcus said. If we can show them that a partnership won't jeopardize those, we might actually get somewhere. Well, that's easier said than done. Eric glanced at his wristcom. Think Kalia's on our side? Hard to say, Marcus admitted. She's cautious, but she's the only one who didn't outright dismiss the idea of cooperation. That's something. Just then, their comms chimed. Kalia's voice came through, formal and measured. Envoys, the council will reconvene in 30 minutes. Please make your way to the main chamber. Time to see if we can make an impression, Eric muttered. Let's go. As they entered the council chamber, Marcus noted the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. While the Xerians still maintained their aloof demeanor, their body language seemed slightly less rigid. Perhaps it was Marcus's imagination, but he thought he detected a flicker of curiosity in their eyes. Kalia stood at the center, her silver hair catching the chamber's crystalline light. You requested this follow-up meeting to address our concerns, she said. What new information do you bring? Marcus stepped forward, datapad in hand. Prime Delegate, esteemed council members, we understand that trust cannot be earned overnight. But we hope to show you that our intentions are sincere and that cooperation can bring mutual benefit. He began by presenting several proposals, an exchange of non-critical scientific data, cultural studies that would involve mutual observation without interference, and a shared database of medical advancements. Each suggestion was carefully framed to highlight how both sides could learn without compromising their autonomy. The council listened in silence. When Marcus finished, Kalia turned to her colleagues, speaking in their native tongue. The discussion that followed was quiet yet intense, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that Marcus couldn't quite follow. Beside him, Eric whispered, What do you think they're saying? No idea, Marcus replied softly. But I hope it's not just another way of saying no. Finally, Kalia addressed them again. Your proposals are intriguing, but we remain concerned. You speak of mutual benefit, yet we have seen other civilizations exploit such arrangements for their own gain. What assurances can you provide that humans will not do the same? Marcus glanced at Eric. The lieutenant gave him a subtle nod as if to say, Go on. Prime Delegate, Marcus said carefully, our history, like yours, has its share of missteps. But that history also teaches us how important it is to move forward. We're not asking you to open all your secrets or abandon your ways. We're simply suggesting that we start small, test the waters, and grow from there. This isn't a demand, it's an invitation. Kalia studied him intently, her violet eyes searching for any hint of deception. An invitation implies trust, she said. And trust must be earned. Absolutely, Marcus agreed. We're willing to take the time needed to earn it. The chamber fell silent again. This time, the council's murmurs were more subdued. Kalia finally spoke. We will consider your proposals. You will have our answer tomorrow. As Marcus and Eric left the chamber, Eric clapped him on the back. That's as good a response as we could have hoped for. Better than an outright refusal, Marcus said, though he still felt a pang of uncertainty. Now we wait. Later that evening, Marcus sat by the viewport of their quarters, watching the emerald clouds shift and swirl outside. Eric joined him, handing over a steaming cup of something hot and fragrant. So what's the plan if they say no? They won't, Marcus replied, though his tone carried a hint of doubt. At least, not completely. I think we've started to chip away at their reservations. Sure, Eric said, taking a sip of his drink. But if this doesn't pan out, you know the council back home won't be happy. Then we'll cross that bridge if we get to it, Marcus said. For now, we focus on earning their trust. Eric grinned. Always the optimist. And you're always the realist. That's why we make a good team, Marcus replied with a faint smile. The two men sat quietly, the tension of the day easing into a calm companionship. While the path forward was uncertain, Marcus knew they would face it together. The Zirian's guarded nature might take time to overcome, but he believed that persistence, understanding, and patience would eventually lead to a breakthrough. Chapter 3. Into Uncharted Territory. The following morning brought a heavy fog that wrapped the crystalline spires of Ziria in a shroud of silver. Marcus and Eric stood at the edge of the observation deck, their breath clouding the glass. The council's decision had been postponed until the evening, giving them an unexpected stretch of free time. So, what's the plan? Eric asked, rubbing his hands together against the chill in the air. Marcus glanced sideways at him. We wait. You're kidding, right? Eric turned away from the window. They've given us the whole day and nothing to do. We're just supposed to sit around. I think the idea is to give us time to reflect, Marcus said, though even he wasn't convinced. Eric snorted. Reflect on what? How much we don't know about these people. He paused, tapping a finger on the window. Why don't we use this time to learn something? I mean, we're diplomats, not statues. Marcus considered it for a moment. Eric was right. Sitting idle wouldn't help them. What do you have in mind? Well, Eric said, leaning back against the console, we could try to see more of the city, maybe talk to some locals, get a feel for what the Zirians actually care about. Exploring without permission might not go over well, Marcus pointed out. If the council finds out. Let's be clear, Eric cut in. We're not talking about sneaking into restricted areas. Just being curious, showing interest. Isn't that what diplomacy's all about? Marcus sighed, though he couldn't help but smile. Eric had a point. All right, he relented. Let's see if we can find a guide who's willing to show us around. Eric grinned. Now you're talking. Finding a guide proved easier than expected. A younger Zirian named Talon, an apprentice to one of the counselors, agreed to escort them through some of the less formal parts of the city. Talon was slim and soft-spoken, but eager to share his knowledge. This structure, Talon explained, pointing to a towering crystalline column, is one of our oldest libraries. The records stored here predate our current government. Marcus examined the column, its surface glinting as though lit from within. So all your historical records are preserved in physical form? Not exactly, Talon said. The material is alive in a sense. It maintains itself, evolving with new information as we add to it. Fascinating, Marcus said. And this is open to the public? Parts of it, Talon replied. The most sensitive knowledge is restricted, of course. But many of our historical and cultural works are available to anyone who seeks them. Eric, meanwhile, had wandered a few steps away, studying a smaller, dome-like structure. What about this one? He called back. Another library? Talon smiled faintly. That's a communal hall, a place for gatherings, celebrations, and public debates. It's where we come together to resolve local matters. Marcus glanced at Eric. Looks like we're not the only ones who have town halls. I was hoping for something a bit more exciting, Eric teased. walking back toward them. What about entertainment? Do you have theaters, sports, that sort of thing? Talon hesitated, then nodded. There are arenas for public performances, musical displays, dramatic storytelling. Our people value intellectual pursuits, so much of our entertainment involves learning in some way. Sounds pretty different from Earth, Marcus said thoughtfully. Our entertainments aren't always so noble. Talon tilted his head. Perhaps that's why we've kept our distance. Our priorities have never aligned. Eric raised an eyebrow at Marcus. Maybe this is a chance to find common ground. Marcus nodded. That's what we're here to do. As they continued their tour, Marcus noticed something unusual. Kalia was standing at the far edge of a plaza, speaking with an older Xerian. Her sharp, violet eyes glanced in their direction before she resumed her conversation. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that she was observing them. Does she always keep such a close watch on visitors? Marcus asked Talon quietly. Kalia is... Talon hesitated, searching for the right word. Protective. She carries a great deal of responsibility. And skepticism, Eric added under his breath. Can't blame her, I suppose. Marcus considered approaching her but decided against it. If she wanted to speak, she would. For now, he focused on taking in as much of the city's culture as possible. By the time they returned to their quarters, Marcus felt a strange mix of accomplishment and unease. While the day's exploration had given him new insight into Xerian life, he couldn't shake the sense that they were still being held at arm's length. Whatever decision the council made that evening would set the tone for everything that came next. Think we'll get a yes? Eric asked as he dropped into a chair, stretching out his legs. Marcus looked out at the now-clearing fog. I don't know, but I think we've shown them we're willing to try. That has to count for something. Let's hope they see it that way, Eric replied. Because if not, we might as well pack it in and head home. Marcus turned back to his friend, a faint smile on his lips. Not yet. Let's wait for their answer. Chapter 4. Breaking Barriers. The council chamber was silent after Kalia's announcement. She had agreed, on behalf of the Xerian delegation, to initiate the first phase of cooperative exchange with the humans. The decision was not without controversy, but the room carried a subdued sense of relief. Marcus, standing beside Eric, kept his expression neutral. Inside, though, he felt the flicker of possibility, one that he wouldn't dare call a victory, but at least a beginning. That went better than expected, Eric murmured as they exited the chamber into the grand corridor of the crystalline complex. Better, yes, Marcus replied quietly. But it's only the first step. This was just permission to start talking. Permission's a big deal, Eric pointed out, his tone light but edged with caution. What now? Marcus glanced over at him. Eric had always been the pragmatist, which Marcus valued, but at times like this, he wished his friend would show a bit more optimism. Now we figure out what we can learn and what we can share. The challenge will be showing them that we're sincere. Eric snorted. Sincerity. Not exactly a skill most diplomats master. Maybe not, Marcus admitted, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. But we'll figure it out. As they reached their quarters, a soft chime sounded from Marcus's wrist communicator. Kalia's voice followed, cool and even. Envoy Holt, Lieutenant Voss, I request your presence in the East Atrium. There is something you should see. Marcus exchanged a look with Eric, who shrugged. Guess we're about to find out what's next. The East Atrium was one of the most stunning parts of the Xerian complex. The walls were made of a semi-transparent material that refracted light into ever-shifting patterns, and the floor seemed to glow faintly beneath their feet. Kalia was waiting for them, flanked by two Xerian aides. She gestured for Marcus and Eric to join her at a central T. ITY peaked. You're willing to share these? To a limited extent, Kalia replied. We are careful about what we reveal, but transparency must start somewhere. If we are to learn about your people, it is only fair that you begin to understand ours. Eric leaned in, picking up a small, translucent sphere. It pulsed faintly as he held it. What's this? Kalia's gaze moved to Eric. A communication node. It stores and transmits information on a secure Xerian network. Eric tilted his head, watching the faint light inside shift and swirl. Not bad. Is this something we can take back to Earth? No, Kalia said firmly. You may study it here, but it cannot leave this planet. Marcus nodded, gesturing for Eric to set it down. Understood. We appreciate your trust. Kalia's sharp violet eyes met his. Trust is not given. It is earned. We'll earn it, Marcus replied steadily. One step at a time. The next few days were filled with study sessions in the atrium. Kalia, along with her aides, explained the purpose and significance of each artifact. Marcus and Eric took turns asking questions, cross-referencing information, and attempting to piece together a more comprehensive understanding of Xerian culture. I still don't get how these things work, Eric muttered one afternoon as he fiddled with a crystalline device. Looks like a paperweight, but it's supposed to, what was it again? It's a memory archiver, Marcus said patiently. It's like a digital library, but it operates through resonance patterns in the material. Eric shook his head. I swear, half the time I think you're making this stuff up. Maybe if you paid closer attention. Before Marcus could finish, Kalia approached, her presence as commanding as ever. Are you always this, uncoordinated? She asked Eric, her tone unreadable. Only when things don't make sense, Eric replied, setting the device down carefully. I'm used to equipment that at least has buttons. Kalia allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Perhaps we should start with simpler devices. Not all technology needs buttons, Lieutenant. Eric gave her a lopsided grin. Guess I'm just old-fashioned. Marcus caught the briefest flicker of amusement in Kalia's eyes, and for a moment, the room didn't feel quite so formal. It was a small thing, just a shared moment of humor, but it was enough to break a layer of the ever-present tension. As the week went on, Marcus and Eric began to sense a subtle shift in Kalia's demeanor. She was still reserved, still cautious, but she no longer seemed entirely closed off. She asked more questions about Earth, about human customs and traditions, and even about their personal lives. One evening, as the atrium grew quiet and the Xerian aides left, Marcus lingered at the table, reviewing notes. Kalia stood nearby, seemingly lost in thought. Eric had already headed back to their quarters, leaving the two of them alone. Do you think your people will ever truly understand us? Kalia asked suddenly. Marcus looked up, surprised. I don't know. Understanding takes time. But I'd like to think it's possible. She studied him for a long moment. Possible, yes, but difficult. You must know that our history makes trust challenging. I know, Marcus said softly. But difficult doesn't mean impossible. Kalia's expression didn't change, but something in her posture seemed to relax. I hope you're right. Marcus smiled faintly. So do I. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Chapter 5, The First Kiss. Marcus wasn't sure why his hands felt cold. He clasped them behind his back, trying to focus on the rhythmic hum of the Xerian atrium's energy conduits. Kalia stood a few feet away, her tall figure partially lit by the glowing patterns on the crystalline walls. The space was empty now, the rest of the council delegates and aides long since departed. The quiet was unnerving, though not unpleasant. Marcus found it easier to think when it was just the two of them, even if Kalia's stern demeanor rarely faltered. Tonight, however, her features seemed softer, her expression almost contemplative. She had been asking questions that felt more personal than the dry, procedural inquiries of previous days. You haven't asked me about my family, she said suddenly. Marcus blinked. I didn't think it was appropriate. Kalia tilted her head slightly, a faint hint of curiosity flickering in her violet eyes. You have spoken of your home, your world's culture, but not of the individuals who shaped you. Is that not relevant to your perspective? Marcus hesitated, then nodded. It is, I suppose. My parents were diplomats too, though on a smaller scale. They worked between different Terran colonies. I grew up hearing about negotiations and compromises. Did they encourage you to follow in their path? Kalia's voice was calm, yet her questions felt probing in a way that made Marcus wonder if she was searching for something specific. They never pushed, he said, but it felt natural. Like something I was supposed to do. They believed in dialogue, in the idea that most conflicts could be resolved by sitting down and talking things through. Kalia looked away as though considering his words. And yet, many humans resort to violence. Marcus exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. That's true. Not all of us are as committed to diplomacy as my parents were. But some of us try. That's why I'm here? Trying, she repeated, the word carrying a faint note of skepticism. Yes. Because it's better than not trying at all. For a moment, Kalia was silent. Then she turned fully toward him, her expression unreadable. And what do you think of our people? Marcus met her gaze. I think your people are careful, intelligent, and deeply protective of your way of life. I think you're slow to trust, but when you do, it means something. Her lips curved slightly. Too subtle to be called a smile, but enough to make Marcus's pulse quicken. A fair assessment. There was a long pause. The atrium seemed to grow quieter, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Marcus felt the urge to close the distance between them, though he wasn't sure why. He wondered if Kalia felt it too. "Kalia," he said softly, "what do you think of us?" She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter than usual. "I think humans are more complex than I expected, and more unpredictable. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Her head tilted slightly, her silver hair catching the faint light. "I have not decided." Another silence fell. Marcus shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. He thought of reaching out, of breaking through the careful distance they had both maintained. But he wasn't sure what reaction he would get. "You haven't decided," he repeated, more to himself than to her. Kalia's eyes met his again, her gaze sharp and searching. "No," she said softly, "but I am considering possibilities." He wasn't sure what to make of her words. Her tone, her posture, even the way she looked at him. It all felt different, less guarded, more open. Marcus took a small step closer, testing the boundary between them. Kalia didn't move away. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes flickered to his mouth for just an instant. So quick he might have imagined it. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said quietly. Kalia's head tilted again, her silver hair shifting slightly. "You haven't." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Marcus felt his heart beating faster. He was close enough now that he could see the fine details of her features, the faint patterns that lined her skin like delicate etchings in glass. "Kalia," he murmured, "would it be all right if—" She moved first. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, just a slight incline toward him. Marcus felt his breath catch. He didn't want to misread the moment, but he couldn't ignore the signal. Slowly, carefully, he closed the remaining gap between them. Her lips were cool, the touch feather-light at first. Marcus barely registered the sensation, as though his mind couldn't keep up with the reality. But then the contact deepened, and he realized he wasn't the only one who had been hesitating. Kalia's hand brushed against his arm, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through him. He leaned in further, the kiss becoming more certain, more deliberate. Kalia responded in kind, her movements still controlled but undeniably present. Marcus felt her hand slide up to his shoulder, her touch firm and deliberate. When they finally pulled apart, Kalia's expression was unreadable again. Her gaze was steady, though, and she didn't step back. Marcus began, then stopped. Words felt insufficient. Kalia studied him for a moment, her violet eyes steady. "Perhaps humans are more unpredictable than I thought," she said softly, then turned and walked toward the glowing patterns on the wall. Marcus watched her go, his pulse still racing. He didn't know what this would mean for their negotiations, for their fragile alliance. All he knew was that something had shifted, and he wasn't sure it could ever go back to the way it was. Chapter 6. Exploring the Unknown. The days following their kiss blurred into a strange, almost surreal routine. Marcus found himself navigating two parallel tracks. The official mission to deepen cooperation between humanity and the Xerians, and his growing connection with Kalia. Both paths were delicate, fraught with unspoken expectations and uncharted boundaries. "You seem distracted," Eric remarked as they walked toward the central archives, a crystalline building that shimmered like a frozen waterfall in the pale Xerian light. Marcus looked at him, startled. "Distracted?" "Yeah." Eric's tone was light, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. "You've been quieter than usual, and that's saying something. Normally, I'm the one who gets called the brooding type." "I'm fine," Marcus said, though he knew Eric wouldn't buy it. "You sure? Because the last time I saw you this quiet, we were pinned down in that Lyran embassy standoff, and you had that, 'I'm about to do something crazy' look." Marcus stopped and turned to face him. "Nothing crazy is happening. I promise." Eric smirked. "Fine. I'll let it drop. For now." They continued on in silence, but Marcus could feel Eric's curiosity lingering. It wasn't that Marcus didn't trust him. Eric was his closest friend, and the person he relied on most during tense negotiations. But what had happened with Kalia felt too fragile to share, too new to risk exposing to anyone else's opinion. Inside the archives, Kalia was waiting for them. She stood near one of the tall, glimmering columns that housed centuries of Xerian knowledge. Her posture was as poised as ever, but when her eyes met Marcus's, there was a subtle shift, something softer, more open. "Envoys," she said, her voice calm. "I thought it might be beneficial for you to see some of our historical records in context." "Beneficial how?" Eric asked, stepping up beside Marcus. "By understanding how our society evolved," Kalia replied. "The choices we made, the challenges we faced, these shaped the culture you now seek to engage with." Marcus nodded, grateful for the focus on work. "That sounds valuable. Thank you for allowing us access." Kalia gestured toward a central terminal, where glowing symbols hovered in midair. "This terminal contains accounts of our early spacefaring years. It was a time of great change, when we first encountered other species." "Sounds familiar," Eric said, raising an eyebrow. "We've had our share of bumps and bruises on that road." Kalia's expression didn't shift, but Marcus thought he caught a faint glimmer of understanding in her eyes. "Perhaps you will find some parallels," she said. They spent the next few hours reviewing Xerian history. Eric leaned against the terminal, asking pointed questions while Marcus took careful notes. Kalia stood nearby, answering when necessary but mostly observing. It felt to Marcus like she was gauging not only their understanding but their intentions. "Why keep this knowledge restricted?" Eric asked at one point. "It's fascinating. Don't you want others to see how far you've come?" Kalia's response was measured. "It is not a matter of pride. We value privacy and discretion. Sharing these records with you is already an unusual step." "Unusual, but appreciated," Marcus added. "We know how important trust is." Her eyes met his, lingering for a moment before she spoke. "Indeed." After the session, Eric left to follow up on another part of the mission, leaving Marcus and Kalia alone in the atrium. The space was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the energy conduits and the occasional murmur of passing Xerians. Kalia moved closer, her voice low. "Your companion is direct. He's straightforward," Marcus said with a faint smile. "But he means well." "I can see that," she said, her tone neutral. "He asks questions that many here would avoid. It is both refreshing and unsettling." Marcus hesitated. "And what about me? How do you find my questions?" Kalia's gaze was steady. "Your questions are more careful. They reveal more about you than about the answers you seek." He wasn't sure how to respond to that. "Is that good or bad?" "Neither," she said. "It is simply an observation." Marcus studied her face, searching for something beneath the calm exterior. "You said the records show your early encounters with other species. Did those encounters ever become personal?" Kalia's eyes narrowed slightly. "You mean to ask if we have formed bonds beyond diplomacy?" "Yes," he said carefully. She was silent for a long moment, then replied, "Rarely. Our culture values caution in all interactions. Even our own alliances are forged slowly, deliberately. Intimacy in any form is not something we give lightly." He nodded, absorbing her words. "And yet, sometimes it happens?" "Sometimes," she admitted. Her gaze didn't waver. "But it always comes with risk." They walked in silence for a while, the atrium's glowing patterns shifting around them. When they reached the edge of the space, Kalia turned to him. "You are an unusual envoy, Marcus Holt," she said quietly. "How so?" he asked. "You listen. You observe. And yet you do not push. You are careful." He smiled faintly. "I don't think you would have allowed me to stay if I wasn't." "Perhaps not," she said. Her voice softened, just barely. "But it is unexpected." They stood there for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. Marcus knew better than to press further. Instead, he simply nodded. "Thank you for your trust," he said. Kalia didn't answer. But she didn't walk away either. And that, Marcus thought, was a start. Chapter 7, A Test of Trust. The council chamber was silent. Marcus and Eric stood at the center, surrounded by a semicircle of Xerian delegates. Kalia sat at the forefront, her face unreadable. The air was thick with tension, though it was more than just another debate. The Xerians' trust, already fragile, was under scrutiny once again. "Envoys," Kalia began, her voice calm but steely, "it has come to our attention that certain factions within your delegation may have had motives other than peaceful exchange." Marcus felt Eric shift beside him. He raised a hand, a gesture of calm. Prime Delegate, I assure you that our mission remains one of cooperation and mutual understanding. If there's been a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? One of the counselors interrupted. What of the surveillance devices found in the cultural archives? Eric's jaw tightened. Those weren't ours. We don't have any record of deploying such equipment. Another counselor leaned forward. How can we be certain? You've asked us to trust you, but evidence suggests otherwise. Kalia raised her hand, silencing the murmurs. Her gaze fixed on Marcus. Can you, without reservation, deny that these devices originated from your delegation? Yes, Marcus said firmly. We have nothing to gain by spying on you. Our mission is built on transparency. Eric added, it's possible these devices were planted by another party. We've seen it before, outside forces trying to sabotage cooperation. Kalia's eyes narrowed slightly. What outside forces? Who would benefit from undermining this partnership? Marcus hesitated. The last thing he wanted to do was introduce suspicion of another species or organization. It could be anyone who feels threatened by the idea of two strong civilizations finding common ground. We faced similar tactics in past negotiations. Our only goal is to identify the source of the issue and address it transparently. Another counselor leaned back, folding his arms. Your words are carefully chosen, but they don't eliminate doubt. Then let us help, Eric said. We'll assist in the investigation. If there's any proof that these devices didn't come from us, it's in everyone's interest to find it. Kalia regarded them both for a long moment before speaking. Very well. You will be allowed to assist our investigators. But understand this, if we find that your delegation was involved, the consequences will be severe. Marcus nodded. We understand, Prime Delegate. And we're prepared to cooperate fully. Later, in their quarters, Eric paced the room, his frustration evident. I knew something like this would happen. We're barely making progress, and now someone's trying to sabotage us. Getting angry won't help, Marcus said, though his own voice was tight with tension. We need to focus on proving our innocence. You really think they'll listen if we do? They're already suspicious of us. They listened enough to let us help, Marcus countered. That's more than I expected. Eric stopped pacing and faced him. So what's the plan? Sit back and wait for them to decide we're guilty? No, Marcus rubbed his temples, thinking hard. We need to show them that we're committed. That we'll do whatever it takes to find out who's responsible. And if it turns out one of our own was involved? Marcus paused. Then we deal with it. But until there's evidence, we proceed as if we're innocent. Eric let out a long breath, leaning against the wall. You're too calm about this. I'm not calm, Marcus said quietly. I'm just focused. If we lose our composure, we lose their trust. Eric ran a hand through his hair. Fine. I'll follow your lead. But if we get dragged down because of someone else's actions, we won't, Marcus interrupted. Because we'll find the truth first. Their investigation began the next day. Zirian's security officers escorted Marcus and Eric into the archives where the surveillance devices had been found. The devices were small, almost imperceptible, embedded within the crystalline walls. The Zirian investigators were methodical, scanning every inch of the space for clues. Marcus worked alongside them, examining the devices without touching them. These aren't made with human technology, he noted. The structure is different, more organic. One of the investigators nodded. We have already determined that the materials do not match Terran standards. However, that does not eliminate the possibility of Terran involvement. True, Eric said, leaning in to get a closer look. But we've dealt with these kinds of implants before. It's the same pattern we've seen from the Narxum Collective. The investigator's gaze ANS planted these devices. The investigator hesitated, then looked to Kalia, who had been standing silently at the edge of the room. Prime Delegate, shall we proceed with this line of inquiry? Kalia's expression was unreadable. After a long moment, she nodded. Proceed. If what the envoys claim is true, then exposing the true source of these devices is in our interest. Marcus caught her eye, a silent exchange passing between them. He could feel the weight of her scrutiny, but also the faintest glimmer of belief. She was giving them a chance, a small, tentative one, but a chance nonetheless. And Marcus knew they couldn't afford to waste it. Chapter 8, A New Path Forward. The Zirian council chamber was unusually quiet. The air, usually humming with faint energy currents, felt still. Marcus and Eric stood at the center once more, their shoulders straight but their expressions calm. After days of investigating the mysterious devices, the truth was finally clear. Now came the hardest part, presenting it in a way that wouldn't shatter the fragile progress they had made. Kalia rose from her seat, her violet eyes fixed on Marcus. Envoy Holt, you requested this audience. What have you discovered? Marcus took a steadying breath. Prime Delegate, we traced the source of the devices back to a rogue faction of the Narxum Collective. Their operatives have been known to interfere with diplomatic efforts across multiple sectors, attempting to sow mistrust and prevent alliances from forming. Eric stepped forward holding a small projection device. We gathered recordings from Xerian scanners and matched the energy signatures to known Narxum implants. Their technology uses a unique biocrystalline structure, one that differs from both Xerian and Terran systems. We've provided the data to your security teams, who confirmed the match. The council murmured, their voices low and skeptical. One counselor raised a hand. And what motive would the Narxum have to disrupt these negotiations? The same motive they've always had, Eric replied. They fear unified forces that might threaten their dominance in trade and technology. If humans and Xerians formed a strong alliance, it could shift the balance of power in ways the Narxum don't want. Kalia held up her hand, silencing the murmurs. If what you say is true, then the fault does not lie with your delegation. However, this revelation alone does not ensure trust between our peoples. We understand, Marcus said earnestly. But it does show that we're committed to transparency and that we'll face challenges together rather than let them divide us. Kalia's expression remained composed, though Marcus thought he caught a flicker of something in her eyes, approval, perhaps, or relief. The council will deliberate. We will consider your findings and determine how to proceed. Marcus nodded respectfully. Thank you, Prime Delegate. We'll await your decision. Outside the chamber, Eric exhaled loudly, running a hand through his hair. Well, that went better than I thought it would. They didn't throw us out. They're still deciding, Marcus pointed out, though a hint of a smile played on his lips. Yeah, but you saw the looks on their faces. They know we're telling the truth, Eric said. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. So what happens now? Now we wait, Marcus said, and hope they're willing to move forward. Eric grunted. You always make it sound so simple. Marcus chuckled. That's because someone has to keep things optimistic. Well, let's hope your optimism pays off, Eric replied, though his tone was lighter than before. Later that evening, Marcus returned to the atrium where they had spent so much time. The space felt different now, less foreign, more familiar. He saw Kalia standing near one of the glowing crystalline columns, her silhouette stark against the shifting light. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, gathering his thoughts, he approached her. Prime Delegate, he began, his voice quiet, thank you for giving us the chance to present our findings. Kalia turned, her gaze steady. You handled the situation well, Marcus. Few would have maintained such composure. It's not just about composure, he said, stepping closer. It's about trust. That's what this whole mission has been about. And I think we're starting to build it. Perhaps, she said, her tone measured. But trust, once lost, is not easily regained. You should be proud that your actions have given us reason to consider moving forward. I am, he admitted. But I'm also cautious. I know this is just the beginning. Kalia regarded him for a moment before speaking. You've shown yourself to be different from what we expected. Different how? Your words align with your actions. You seem to genuinely care about understanding us rather than simply achieving your mission's goals. That's because I do care, Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. This isn't just a mission to me. It's an opportunity. One I don't want to waste. Kalia held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slightly. You may find that we have more in common than you realize. For a time, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, the light shifting around them, the air calm and still. It was a moment of quiet understanding, one that didn't require more words. The following day, the council delivered their decision. The Xerians would continue with the next phase of cooperation, slowly expanding their cultural and technological exchanges. It wasn't a sweeping alliance, but it was progress, a cautious step forward that both sides could build on. As Marcus and Eric prepared to leave the council chamber, Kalia approached them. Your efforts have not gone unnoticed, she said, her voice steady. This is not an easy path, but you have shown that it can be walked. Marcus inclined his head. Thank you, Prime Delegate. We'll do everything we can to make this work. Kalia's eyes softened just slightly. I believe you will. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Marcus and Eric to reflect on everything that had transpired. It had been a challenging journey, but one that held the promise of something more, something worth fighting for.